Hello and welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. An uptick in diplomacy between China and the United States. Will that set meaningful guardrails for the competition between the world's two largest economies? First, there was the defense ministers' meeting in Singapore. Then the two countries' senior economic officials talked about tariffs, among other things. And most recently, the 5-hour meeting between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. What concrete outcomes have come out of these China-U.S. engagement? Now, Daniel Russel is Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs under President Barack Obama. Secretary Russel, great to see you again. Welcome to The Hub on CGTN.
Thanks for having me.
So, Assistant Secretary Russel, first of all, I want to get your take on the recent China-U.S. engagement. What do you think have been the more meaningful outcomes out of these talks?
Well, I don't think we've seen yet the outcome that the world really wants, which is the stabilization of the strategic relationship between Washington and Beijing. There was a time last year, 2021, when the two sides seemed to be taking some baby steps. There was the resolution of some cases, such as that of Madam Meng Wanzhou, and the release of two Michaels. There was some resolution of issues relating to student visas and to the movement of journalists like yourself. But thus far, notwithstanding two video conferences between our two presidents and a number of meetings between National Security Advisor and Director Yang and the Secretary of State and the State Counselor, we haven't really yet seen adequate progress to shift the focus of the relationship from a kind of confrontational character to something closer to cooperation.
I want to talk about some specific issues. Let's talk about tariffs. In your opinion, should Joe Biden at least roll back some of the Trump-era China tariffs?
It's true that tariffs hurt both sides in a trade war. I think that the consistent overall goal of the U.S. government consistently has been to promote free trade, and that's why every U.S. president has pushed China to give American companies as much access to China's markets as Chinese companies have to U.S. markets. But when you look at the Trump administration's tariffs, remember that China did not meet its commitments under the Phase 1 trade deal. It fell very far short on manufactured goods, services, even agricultural products. So it's fair for people in the U.S. to ask, if China didn't meet its pledge in the agreement, why should the U.S. be unilaterally lifting tariffs? What's China going to do in return? So I think
Secretary Russell, then President Donald Trump started all this.
Right. I mean, both sides have a case to make about what they were doing to respond to the behavior of the other. Tariffs are a last resort. And the Trump administration believed that it was imposing tariffs in an effort to open the Chinese market and to get the same kind of access in China that the Chinese companies get in the United States. It did not work. It certainly has imposed some costs on American consumers. So I think the common sense answer ought to be for both sides to remove barriers to market access.
But under the circumstances, with midterm elections around the corner, do you think Joe Biden has political space to do the right thing, not just the politically expedient thing, but also the economically sound thing?
Well, I'm sure that the White House is weighing both the economics, the politics, but also the diplomacy of tariff relief. The news report suggests that the president is considering a modest adjustment to tariffs that would focus on a small number of products that directly affect American consumers. But hey, if I were still in the U.S. government, the question that I would be asking is, since the tariffs were originally imposed in response to unfair China trade practices, can't we reach a win-win agreement with Beijing where both sides take reciprocal steps, even if they're small steps, to reduce tariffs and to reduce non-tariff trade barriers as well.
Do you think the tariffs have achieved the results that Donald Trump said they would? For example, reducing the trade deficit, increasing market access, and helping the American consumers and companies?
Well, I think that all the facts and simple arithmetic shows that the answer is no, that the Trump administration's strategy and its approach to China, both in the first year or so when President Trump seemed prepared to give everything away for free to China, and then in the subsequent 3 years where President Trump took a very aggressive, even a nasty tone and set of policies towards China. Neither one of these approaches have yielded either good results, little, or certainly not the outcomes that then President Trump claimed that they would.
Secretary Russell, I want to move on and talk about the issue of Taiwan. Earlier, I interviewed your former colleague, Susan Thornton, and she warned that the issue of Taiwan remains the most concerning flashpoint in U.S.-China relations. And you also tweeted this February, actually, saying that Beijing's One China principle and Washington's One China policy are actually different. Can you elaborate?
Well, I'll make 2 points. There's no question in my mind that Taiwan is an area of grave risk. Lose sight of the fact that the costs of an armed conflict would be catastrophic. They would be catastrophic to everybody. But the costs would vastly outweigh any possible gains that the People's Republic of China could hope to gain from military action. So China's fundamental policy since 1979 is that the issue of the status and the future of Taiwan should be resolved peacefully. And if peaceful resolution of the cross-strait issues isn't possible in our lifetime, I hope it is, but if it isn't, then peaceful management of the issue, I think, is the only rational goal for us to work towards. You know, the status quo between the mainland and Taiwan is probably unacceptable to people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. But no matter how you look at it, the alternatives to the status quo as things stand today are a lot worse. So it makes sense for all parties to be careful and to work to preserve the status quo. But the second thing I would say in direct answer to your question is this, that the One China principle is not identical to the One China policy of the United States. The U.S.-China relationship, the foundational document, Shanghai Communique, is built on ambiguity over the status of Taiwan.
But Secretary Russell, with each communique, which there are 3 of them actually, if you look at that 1982 communique, you know this better than I do, it was clearer in that Washington recognized Beijing as the sole legitimate government of all of China, including the region of Taiwan.
No, that is definitely not the American reading of the third communique. Underneath the deliberate ambiguity between Beijing and Washington's interpretation of the 3 communiques, there are 3 very simple and crucially important propositions. Number 1, that Beijing would not use force and coercion to achieve unification. Number 2, that the United States would not support Taiwan independence. And number 3, that Taiwan would not foreclose the possibility of eventual peaceful reconciliation. And I think that those 3 principles can keep the peace and need to be respected.
But in the third and the last communique in the 1980s, Washington not only acknowledged but also recognized that the People's Republic of China is the sole legitimate government, and Taiwan is a part of it.
No, the United States acknowledged China's position that Taiwan is a part of China. And it is precisely in the ambiguity of the word acknowledge that the two sides were able to continue with their respective one China principle and one China policy.
But Secretary Russel, many in Beijing said that especially the former Trump administration was merely paying lip service to the one China principle. They say the Biden administration is doing that too, in that they recognize or acknowledge, whichever term you use, that Taiwan is part of China. There's only one China. But on the other hand, they're promoting a senior diplomatic engagement between Washington and Taipei, which contradicted what the U.S. itself has recognized through the three communiques.
The firm commitment of the United States is that we do not have a two China policy or a one China, one Taiwan policy. And it's for that reason that the United States terminated diplomatic relations with Taiwan, with the then Republic of China, and instead maintains friendly and robust unofficial ties, economic ties, social and cultural ties, and so on. It has certainly been the case consistently that there have been some interactions, some communication between political figures and U.S. government officials and the authorities on Taipei. In fact, those connections were very constructive and very helpful in promoting cross-strait progress in the 2000s. But nothing that the United States has done or should do would connote recognition of statehood by Taiwan. That said, the position of the United States is that the ultimate status of Taiwan has yet to be resolved, and that it should be resolved peacefully on terms that are acceptable to people on both sides of the Taiwan Straits. The United States does not oppose unification. The United States, though, does desire and not insist that peaceful unification come as a consensual matter, something that the people on Taiwan as well as the mainland can ultimately agree on.
When I became president, I made a strategic decision that we would rebalance our foreign policy and play a larger and long-term role here in the Asia-Pacific.
In 2011, the Obama administration laid out its strategic rebalancing to Asia. Many security strategists believe the real aim was to contain a rising China.
Tensions have increased in the last several years. This gives the United States a vested interest in ensuring that disputes are managed peacefully.
Daniel Russel and other Washington officials believe the U.S. had responsibilities in the region and called out China for its quote-unquote troublesome behavior. Under Donald Trump, China-U.S. relations took a nosedive. Retired from foreign service, Daniel Russel urged Trump to fix U.S.-China relations.
It will be the question of whether the administration finds a formula for viewing and engaging with China that is not branding China as an adversary or an enemy.
The Trump administration's trade offensive and political hostility brought China-U.S. relations to its lowest point in decades.
Each country feels it's protecting the status quo and its legitimate rights, but thinks that the other country's behavior is disruptive and unjust.
Can China and the U.S. still reconcile their differences in Asia-Pacific? My interview with Daniel Russel continues. All right, let's talk about America's Asia strategy. You actually helped engineer then President Obama's pivot to Asia or rebalancing to Asia. You were a special assistant to the president and later serving as the Assistant Secretary of State. How would you compare the pivot to Asia strategy 10 years ago versus the Indo-Pacific strategy of Joe Biden?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that there are similarities and there are differences. I think the big difference is that in 2009, when President Obama first took office, he identified two huge problems. One is that the United States was facing a tremendous recession. There was a global recession. And so given that the Asia-Pacific region is such a prosperous, dynamic, important driver of global growth with a huge and growing middle class and so on, the importance of the Asia-Pacific to the American economy was greater than ever, number one. And number two, that the previous administration, the Bush administration, although...
You mean Trump?
Like other... No,
Bush?
I mean the Bush administration, when Obama took office, had an excessive focus on the Middle East, on Iraq, Afghanistan, the global war, and terror. So the U.S. was overweighted in the Middle East and underweighted in Asia. That's why we called it a rebalance. It was about getting the balance right between America's interests in the Asia-Pacific and America's interests in the Atlantic or in the Middle East. Now, I think that for the Biden administration, the importance of Asia was never in question. And the issue was not recovering from an excessive focus on the Middle East. It was recovering from America first, from a series of misguided policies and decisions that damaged American credibility and also damaged American partnerships and alliances, including in the Asia-Pacific region. So he came into office, President Biden, with three clear objectives. Number one, strengthen the United States, promote domestic recovery. Number two, rebuild and restore faith in the United States and America's partnerships and alliances. And then number three, engineer an approach to China that balances the competitive elements in our relationship with the responsibility that we both have to cooperate, particularly on key global issues.
Washington says the current Indo-Pacific strategy does not aim to contain China. But if you look at the nature of AUKUS, the nature of the Quad, the nature of IPEF, isn't Indo-Pacific strategy a China containment strategy of sorts?
I think it's a China competition strategy, not a containment strategy. And to me, the interesting thing about the Quad is when you read the statement by the leaders, it's not about China. It's about how the four countries can pool their resources, their respective strengths, and deliver better outcomes, important outcomes in global goods to the countries in the region. So in a way, what the United States seems to be trying to do in the Indo-Pacific strategy is to outcompete China and to demonstrate that democracies can really perform, can really provide benefits in a way that countries in Asia feel comfortable with.
But don't you think, Secretary Russel, so many arguments, so many so-called competitions are man-made? At the end of the day, many would argue that despite the different terminologies and names, there has been not so much of a difference when it comes to the Chinese approach and the American approach, at least not as big as some politicians wanted people on both sides to think.
Well, that's an interesting point that you're making. I would say, though, in terms of the bilateral relationship, throughout my career, I've seen pendulum swings in the U.S. relationship where sometimes things were easier and better, sometimes things were more difficult. But now it really feels less like it's a pendulum and more like it's a downward spiral.
Do you think the pendulum will swing yet again, or do you think U.S.-China relations are only headed towards a direction of great power rivalry, intensity, and vicious cycles?
I think it largely depends on our leaders. Right now, my view is that the U.S. and China find themselves in what's called a security dilemma, which means that each side feels like it is being threatened by the other side. Each side feels that it's taking defensive action, but that defensive action is being perceived by the other as provocative action. So it's accelerating the cycle, the dilemma, and that to make a political gesture of compromise to the other is very, very difficult. And if there is such a gesture, it tends to look less like an olive branch and more like a Trojan horse, like a trick. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't believe in the Thucydides trap. I don't think there's inevitability about a descent into strategic rivalry level of war between the U.S. and China. I think that leaders have the ability to shape the nature of the relationship of competition. Mm-hmm. So the responsibility lies with our leaders to take a step back from the edge and for the two sides to find ways to manage the relationship responsibly.
Right. Secretary Russel, if you could pick up the phone and advise the current White House about this China policy, what would you say? What kind of China policy is badly needed at this point?
Well, I can pick up the phone.
You actually can, I know.
My friends in the White House, and I do speak to them. And I think fundamentally that they have it right in its essence, which is that we should try to create a balanced relationship with Beijing that combines elements of competition and cooperation, that we should be honest about the areas where we fundamentally disagree. I think that my friends in Washington fully understand that a small spark could start a big fire between the U.S. and China, and that we do not have the right kind of mechanisms to contain that or to extinguish it. Because, an occasional meeting of officials or dialogues that are very adversarial, handing over a list of demands, that's not real diplomacy and that's not real mm-hmm. problem solving. It's not adequate. We have to work on narrowing our differences. It is very hard to work together, but we've learned that working against each other turns out to be even harder and more dangerous. So it is incumbent on both sides to try to avoid another Cold War, because heaven knows the first Cold War was not any fun.
Well, some say it is a consensus among the American liberals and conservatives, people on the political right and the political left, that China is an enemy, or at least a rival. Is that your sense that you're getting to? That the public sentiment against China is entrenched somehow?
First, I'd say there's a big difference between a rival and an enemy.
Yes, those are two different things.
Right. You can have rival sports teams and rival athletes who find ways to compete in which the competition makes both of them better, both of them stronger. An enemy is a different story, and it's critically important that the leaders in both countries work to avoid descent into that kind of adversarial relationship. That would be terribly dangerous for the entire world, certainly for both countries. It is unquestionably true that attitudes in the United States in nearly every sector, including worryingly in the business community, attitudes towards China have soured. There's a great deal of disappointment. There's a great deal of concern. And I think it's undeniable that the experiences that many American businesses, that many American diplomats, many American officials have experienced dealing with China or operating in China have led to this level of frustration. I know that attitudes towards the United States and Americans in China also have deteriorated. As China grows bigger, stronger, more powerful, wealthier, countries around China and countries dealing with China are more directly affected by China's behavior. And if they perceive China's behavior to be coercive or threatening, that fear is going to be magnified by the size and the strength of growing China. So big countries have to learn to tread very carefully. It's been a hard lesson for America as a superpower to learn, and heaven knows America has had many, many decades to work on it.
Sure, Secretary Russell, but Beijing argues that there's such a thing as echo chamber effects, in that English is the dominant language, the Western media is monopolizing global public discourse on politics, or largely so. The soft power of the West, and sometimes China's proposals and China's initiatives are lost in translation. One last question, where do you think Beijing and Washington can start to rebuild trust? What are some of the deliverable action items that you think the two sides can start doing?
The efforts have to take place in multiple sectors and at multiple levels. First and foremost, I think that the personal relationship between our two leaders is extraordinarily important. We all know that Zoom is a poor substitute for in-person discussions, and I'm very hopeful that the time is not too far off when our two leaders can meet. But at the same time, we have to have genuine negotiations and real communication at every level between our governors, between our business people, between our diplomats, and between our soldiers. And that dialogue has to aim at solving problems, narrowing differences, and building a more resilient relationship.
Secretary Russell, always good to talk to you. Thank you for coming on our show.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wang. Great to see you too.
And that's all we have for this edition of The Hub. Tell us what you think matters. Send us a message on Weibo, Douyin, or other social media platform. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.